December 1943. Across occupied Europe, silence had settled like a fog. Cities still functioned, trains still ran, but beneath the surface fear ruled everything. The occupying forces watched every street, every letter, every whisper. Yet even under total control, a quiet resistance was forming, one led not just by soldiers but by women. They came from different worlds, a teacher from Warsaw, a nurse from Lyon, a university student from Amsterdam. None of them carried weapons, yet each carried something far more dangerous: information, codes, and the will to defy. In cellars and attics they passed messages through candlelight. They forged papers, guided fugitives across borders, and transmitted radio signals that could cost them their lives. Every message sent, every name spoken, was a roll of the dice against an empire that tolerated no disobedience. But bravery has a price. By 1944, many of these women had been discovered, betrayed by informants, traced by intercepted radio signals, or caught during secret missions. Their arrest was swift and merciless. They were dragged from their homes, beaten, interrogated, and transported by train to a place they had never heard of, a camp built specifically for women. The journey was long and cold. Packed into cattle cars, they had no idea where they were going. Some whispered prayers, others memorized the names of those beside them, promising that if even one survived, the world would know what happened. When the doors finally opened, they saw it. Endless barbed wire, watchtowers cutting into the sky, the air thick with smoke, a single word painted on the gates: Ravensbrück. This was no ordinary prison. It was a place designed to break them, body, mind, and spirit. Guards stripped away their clothes, their names, their dignity. Each woman became a number, a mark on a list. Yet as they stood shivering in the snow, something remarkable endured. They looked at one another and understood. They were not alone, and though their captors had taken everything, they could not take that. Among them were secret agents of the resistance, couriers, nurses, and students. They spoke different languages, prayed to different gods, but shared one silent vow: if we cannot fight outside, we will fight from within. They didn't yet know how. But that night, as the gates of Ravensbrück closed behind them, the seeds of a hidden network began to take root, one that would, against all odds, outsmart their captors from the inside. Morning began before the sun. A siren, a shout, the clang of boots on frozen ground. Thousands of women forced into line, their breath rising in the cold air like smoke. Ravensbrück was a world stripped of colour. Grey uniforms, grey walls, grey skies. Days blurred together under hunger, exhaustion, and cruelty. Food was a thin broth. Sleep was a privilege. Hope, a dangerous luxury. Each woman had a task: sewing uniforms, hauling stones, sorting parts in the armament factories. The work was endless, and the smallest mistake could mean a beating, or worse. Yet even here, in this place built to destroy them, the women began to find ways to endure. They learned to communicate without words: a glance, a nod, a small gesture of the hand. A few shared scraps of bread, others whispered prayers when guards turned their backs. Each act, no matter how small, became a thread holding their humanity together. Among them were women of astonishing courage and intellect: doctors, teachers, scientists, and agents. They began to notice patterns: who the guards trusted, who handled paperwork, who delivered supplies. And slowly an invisible web began to form. At night, huddled together in the freezing barracks, they shared memories of their lives before the war. Stories of children, of music, of freedom. It was more than nostalgia, it was resistance. To remember was to declare, we are still human. Friendship became their first act of defiance. One woman would trade her meagre ration to save another from starvation. Another would risk punishment to mend a torn shoe or hide a sick friend from inspection. These moments of quiet bravery spread like fire through the camp, unseen, but unstoppable. The guards saw only prisoners. What they could not see was that beneath the suffering something was growing, a secret unity. The women began to watch, to listen, to learn the camp's rhythms. They noticed which officers carried documents, which trains came and went, which messages were sent, and though no one dared speak it aloud, a silent thought began to take hold. If they could survive, If they could find a way to reach the outside world, perhaps they could fight back. Even from here, Ravensbrück was meant to crush the human spirit. Instead, within its walls, it awakened one of the most remarkable networks of courage the war would ever see. By 1944, the camp seemed unbreakable, a machine of despair that ran on fear and silence. But within its heart, a different machine was forming, built not of steel or wire, but of whispers, courage, and trust. It began with a few women who had once served in the resistance, trained agents and couriers who understood secrecy. They recognized each other not by names, but by small signs, a phrase in French, a habit of folding paper twice, the calm gaze of someone who had seen interrogation and survived. At first, their goal was simple, survival. But soon, survival became resistance. Some prisoners were assigned to the camp offices, forced to type records and sort documents. They began memorizing names of the dead and missing, secretly copying them onto scraps of paper hidden in clothing seams or inside hollowed-out soap bars. Others worked in workshops, where they slipped notes into supply crates or sabotaged shipments bound for the front lines. The most daring of all found ways to smuggle messages beyond the fences. A sympathetic civilian worker, a guard who could be bribed with food or favours, even a coded line in a Red Cross letter that seemed ordinary but carried vital information. Piece by piece, a network grew, invisible but alive. It linked French, Polish, Dutch, and Norwegian prisoners into one silent alliance. Each woman knew almost nothing about the others. If one was caught, the rest could still survive. It was the same discipline they had used in the resistance, reborn behind barbed wire. Through stolen moments and secret signals, they began to record everything: the names of those executed, the details of experiments, the dates of transports, the truth, gathered at the edge of death. They passed this information to the outside world, where it reached resistance groups and eventually Allied intelligence. No one could believe it at first, that women imprisoned inside a camp could be sending real intelligence reports, but it was true, and those reports would later become vital evidence of the crimes committed there. Each day, they risked their lives. Each night, they reminded one another why. Because if they could get the truth out, even one name, one date, one story, then the world would know. Inside the walls of Ravensbrück, surrounded by cruelty and death, these women had built something extraordinary, a living network of defiance, powered by nothing more than courage and the will to remember. By the winter of 1944, Ravensbrück had become a city of suffering. Tens of thousands of women, from every corner of occupied Europe, were now imprisoned behind its walls. And yet, within this place meant to erase identity, defiance began to bloom in ways that no one could have imagined. It started quietly. A doctor from Poland refused to follow the camp's brutal medical orders. Instead of assisting in cruel experiments, she sabotaged procedures, diluted chemicals, and misrecorded data, small acts that saved lives but could have ended her own. A seamstress working in the camp's uniform factory deliberately sewed flaws into the stitches, tiny errors that would weaken the fabric used for military clothing. An accountant altered lists of prisoners scheduled for execution, changing identification numbers to spare the lives of those she could. Each act was invisible to the guards, but together they formed a storm of resistance. The women formed secret groups to protect those most at risk, especially the Polish prisoners subjected to experiments known among inmates as the rabbits. When word spread that these women were to be executed to hide the evidence, others hid them in the barracks, trading places, switching identities, confusing the records. When roll call came, they stood shoulder to shoulder, refusing to reveal who was who. They would live or die together. Even amid starvation and disease, the women found ways to share courage. A smuggled pencil became a diary. A lullaby sung in a dozen languages became a hymn of hope. Each night they reminded one another that the world beyond the barbed wire still existed, and that somehow they would return to it. Some guards began to notice the quiet unity among the prisoners, but they couldn't understand it. They mistook compassion for weakness. They never realized that kindness itself had become a weapon. The women's defiance was not loud, and it was never seen on a battlefield, but it was far more dangerous, because in a place where everything human was meant to be crushed, they had kept their humanity alive, and that, more than any weapon, any escape, any open revolt, was the one thing their captors could never defeat. By the spring of 1945, the empire that had once seemed invincible was collapsing. The distant rumble of artillery echoed through the nights. The guards grew restless. Orders changed daily. Trains stopped coming. And for the first time, the women of Ravensbrück began to believe that the end was near. But freedom did not come gently. As the front drew closer, the camp erupted in chaos. Thousands of prisoners were forced onto death marches, long columns of starving, sick women driven into the forests and roads of a dying war. Those too weak to walk were left behind or shot where they fell. Inside the camp, the few who remained waited in silence, unsure whether rescue or annihilation would reach them first. Bodies lay unburied, the guards vanished, and for days there was only stillness, broken by distant gunfire and the cry of the living among the dead. When liberation finally came, it was almost unreal. The soldiers who entered Ravensbrück found women who weighed barely 40 kilograms, yet still stood with quiet dignity. They had no strength to cheer. Some simply stared at the open gates in disbelief, too afraid it might be another trick. Freedom, after so much pain, felt almost unbearable. Many survivors could not speak of what they had seen. Some returned home to find their families gone, their countries changed, their memories dismissed by those who could not imagine such horror. So they remained silent. For years, even decades, they carried their stories in the shadows of their minds. Only later, when historians began to uncover the truth, did the full scope of their resistance come to light. Among the testimonies and faded documents, the story of the secret network emerged. The women who had recorded names, sabotaged orders, and smuggled evidence to the outside world. Their courage had preserved the memory of those who perished and exposed the crimes committed behind the walls of Ravensbrück. They had fought without guns or uniforms, armed only with intelligence, compassion, and unshakable resolve. Their defiance had no monuments, no medals, no parades, but it lived in the documents they saved, in the lives they protected, and in the history they refused to let die. Ravensbrück was built to break women. Instead, it revealed their strength. And even now, long after the gates have rusted and the walls have fallen silent, their story endures, a reminder that courage can survive even in the darkest place on earth. In the ruins of war, history often remembers the battles, the generals, and the flags. But courage does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it hides behind barbed wire. Sometimes it whispers when shouting is forbidden. The women of Ravensbrück were never meant to be remembered. Their names were erased, their faces forgotten, their deeds buried beneath silence. And yet, they left behind something indestructible. Proof that even in a place built to extinguish hope, the human spirit can still find a way to resist. They did not fight with weapons or armies. They fought with compassion, intelligence, and faith in one another. They fought by refusing to become what their captors wanted them to be. The documents they smuggled, the lives they saved, the secrets they carried, all became part of a legacy stronger than fear. They showed the world that resistance is not always loud, that defiance can live in the smallest acts of humanity. And perhaps that is their greatest victory, that their story still reaches us decades later across the silence they endured. Because as long as we remember them, they never truly vanished. Their courage still speaks, softly, clearly, reminding us that even in the darkest places light can endure.